Hi, welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. My name is Len Edgerly, and today is Friday, April 8th, 2022 in Sanibel, Florida. My guest for this episode is Dana Souza, who is the new City Manager of Sanibel. You may remember on the Kindle Chronicles about a year ago that I spoke with Judith Zimomra, who at the time was in her 20th year as Sanibel's city manager. When she retired in the fall of 2021, they hired a consultant to evaluate 96 candidates for the job, and Dana was the top selection. At the time, he was serving as deputy city manager in Naples, Florida, which is 41 miles south of here on the Gulf Coast, just south of Fort Myers. Dana has 36 years of experience in local governments. He's served the communities of Greenville, South Carolina, Marco Island, Florida, Portland, Maine, Union, New York, and New Bedford, Massachusetts. He is a graduate of Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island, where he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in public administration. The home that we bought here in Sanibel in December is part of a homeowners association, or HOA, and I had a chance to see the new city manager in action at the annual meeting of the HOA in early March. It was a large gathering under kind of a tent, about 200 people there. And after Dana's introductory remarks, the to that point quiet gathering got fairly animated. And it turns out that our quiet neighborhood has been discovered as a shortcut frequently used by drivers trying to avoid stop-and-go traffic on Sanibel's main road, which is named Periwinkle Way. And some of the neighbors at the meeting got really pretty emotional about the problem of cars driving faster than the posted 20 miles an hour in our neighborhood. And one guy said that he's taken to standing in front of his house aiming a radar speed detector at speeders. And I could tell that Sanibel Police Chief William Dalton, who was also at the meeting and had been a guest also last year, he didn't think that was a very good idea. But you're going to hear Dana recall that HOA meeting in our conversation. For the interview, I invited him to meet me here at the house. We're kind of post-COVID here. And so we recorded the interview here at my desk in the bedroom overlooking the golf course. He brought a white 3-ring notebook with the Sanibel Plan in it, which we discussed, and he'd marked a couple of sections with tabs so that he could read them. Here is the recording that I made of our conversation. Well, I love thinking of first days on jobs, and yours, I think, was November 15th, 2021.
Yes.
Which probably seems like another era at this point, given that all that you've done to immerse yourself. Any images or things that happened that first day that were amusing or terrifying or made you sure it was the right thing? What's your strongest memory of that particular day?
Well, there was nothing that was terrifying, so let me start there.
That's good.
Yeah, it was good. And because I'm still traveling in from off island every day for work, I think that impression of coming over the bridge, and I'm an early riser, so I'm here before sunrise or right around sunrise, and that time of the day is really special to me anyway. So there's this sort of the aura that is over the island at that time of day. The waters are generally calm, the light's just coming, so I call that the improving sky. And there it is. It's set out in front of me with the lighthouse on the left and these beautiful vistas beyond. So the setup for coming into work is this place is just gorgeous. And I've worked in other beautiful communities, and each one is unique in its own right. But here you are arriving on Sanibel, and it's just a gorgeous day. And then coming into the building is it's a different kind of a arrival from what I'm used to in terms of how the structure is. Parking lots that are unpaved, so that they're pervious surfaces, and all of this, which fits into the character of the island, was pretty unique.
Yeah.
But the welcoming was very warm.
Flowers on your desk? Or?
No flowers on my desk. In fact, I guess the one thing that was a little bit of a surprise is that I'm 6'4" and Judy wasn't. So the way that she had the office set up was different from how I would like it, and the desk was really small for me, so I felt like I was in middle school again.
That's good.
But it worked for her. But I like a stand-up desk. So with the length of time it takes to order that, that just came in a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I don't like to have a desk between me and people when I meet with them, so I like to have that open space. So it's working great for me now.
I love that thought of coming over the bridge, because I have a similar feeling when how we heard about the island was my ex-wife married a guy whose family had a winter home here. So my two daughters have been coming here ever since they were 10 years old, and they had a tradition that every time they got to the causeway, they would play the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song, Sanibel. And I thought, well, that's so touching. And she came to visit a couple of weeks ago, and I'm driving us back from the airport, and all of a sudden I hear on her iPhone, she's played the Sanibel song, just like she did 30 years ago. Yeah. And it sort of gave me chills, and but then to come over the bridge and know that this is not only a beautiful place, beautiful time of the morning, but this is kind of my island now. I'm in charge of what happens here. That had to be kind of a full set of emotions.
It does. It is a full set of emotions. And, for people, I know that you have a radio audience, but for people who don't know what arriving on Sanibel is like, it's really a series of spans that you encounter. And so there's the high span, which is first span A, is technically referred to. And then you get down to the beach areas that are used by residents of Lee County. And so there's a different perspective as you arrive on each one of those of the island. That from the higher span you can see the channel and you can see the points of the island, and then on a clear day I think you can see as far down as Naples. At least that's what I like to imagine. Mm-hmm. But it's just stunning, and each aspect of that arrival is. And then the other transition that I always find is kind of an awakening, but also startling if you're used to this heavily built environment that we encounter over on the Lee County side, is that you go from highly developed areas, you transition a little bit before you get to the toll booth, but then when you arrive on the island, clearly you're in a place with one-lane roads and you don't see the high-rise developments that you see on other barrier islands in Southwest Florida. So it sets up this whole unique feeling. And Periwinkle Drive, because there's a section of the road that is fully canopied, especially between Sanibel and where Dunlop Road is. Again, it's just this another phase of arriving on Sanibel that makes it special.
Yeah, and it has sort of feels like a time travel, because you end up thinking I've arrived somewhere before the invention of traffic lights.
That's right, and street lights.
And street lights.
Yeah,
now I hadn't thought of that. Is that because of the wildlife?
It's because of the Dark Sky Initiative that Sanibel is truly committed to. Huh. So, other communities that are committed to that will use reflectors or ensure that their lights are pointing downward and not upward. But here, the belief is that why contribute to that at all?
Yeah,
our speeds on the road are low speeds, and so if people behave and obey those rules, then they could drive safely at night.
Yeah,
and it does give you a chance to see some wildlife at night that you might not otherwise if it was really illuminated.
Yeah, we saw a fox coming in on Bailey a while back. Quite a sight. Well, we mentioned Periwinkle. There's another experience, and I like to imagine you in these different scenes. So you're coming or going on Periwinkle, and the traffic is pretty much stop and go. What emotions does a city manager have sitting in that kind of traffic on the main street through his community?
Well, thankfully for me, it was something that I knew about because I had been to Sanibel before, and this was a place when my wife and I would ride a motorcycle. We would come to Sanibel, But the good thing is that you're riding a motorcycle on Sanibel. The bad thing is that when traffic stops, it's hot.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be sitting on a motorcycle in dense traffic where it's not moving for a while. But in my job, I do think about the congestion and how that affects people moving about. But I think my first impression about it as an employee here on Sanibel was I thought about Wiscasset, Maine.
Oh, yeah, I know that.
So you know that area?
That narrow bridge and going across?
The narrow bridge, but also when you're coming down the hill through the center of town, the speed limit changes.
Yeah.
And so you're on Route 1, you're moving along pretty well, even though it's two-lane traffic. But then you get to Wiscasset, and there's this sense of...
everything slows down.
And
you get the little lobster shack there by the bridge. And,
and there's you can stop and get lunch. There's plenty of things to do if you want to, but... time slows down in Wiscasset, and that's what I felt about here. Is that's just part of the character of the island, and there's not an intent to expand the roadway widths to accommodate the vehicle. It really is about the vehicle existing within the environments of the island. So it made me think about that. I know that the congestion can be frustrating for both residents and so the Sanibel Plan speaks to that, and there are some ideas in there that could be discussed as part of a community dialogue, and so we'll see how council wants to approach that as we're going through a strategic planning process. And I know traffic comes up often.
Yeah. That Sanibel Plan was one of the things that just really attracted us to Sanibel. And maybe just when you tell somebody about the community you're city manager of now, it has this thing called the Sanibel Plan. How do you describe briefly the history and the significance of it?
Yeah, I guess there's two ways that I look at it. One is for people who work in the field that I work in. It's the city's comprehensive plan, which is statutorily required in communities in Florida and across the country that you have to have a comprehensive plan. So first, it serves as the city's comprehensive plan. But what it does, it sets up, it's the foundation to preserving the uniqueness of this island. And that, as you know, is the intent of incorporation here. And I brought the Sanibel Plan with me, and I'm going to, if you're okay, I'm going to read something.
I love
because
it, yes.
I do think it's one of the things that was, as a candidate, that stood out to me and said, boy, this place is really, it's a known place to me, but as you peel back the layers of the onion, there's a lot to learn. But right at the beginning on page 2 of the plan, it states, the original Sanibel Plan adopted in 1976 marked a substantial departure from the pre-existing Lee County zoning and development standards. These would have permitted about 30,000 residential units on Sanibel with virtually no environmental safeguards. The Sanibel Plan aimed to reduce that figure to about 7,800 residential units. It also developed new planning guidelines to reduce the potential threat to life, beaches, and structures from hurricanes, and provide adequate supplies for water. And also it goes on to talk about preserving the environment. And so when you look at that as a foundational element of the comprehensive plan, before the island was overdeveloped, there were areas that had been improved already, and that's where you have the high-rise buildings on the east end of the island. But the intent was, let's contain that, and let's not allow that to expand the way that it's expanding on the other side of the bay. And that is really unique to look at. First, you think about from an economic perspective when there's the zoning that's in place that would allow for 30,000 residential units to be developed, and to pair that back to 7,800. The economics of it say, well, why would you do that? Don't you need that to sustain? But I want to read another portion of the plan, too, which is, I think I have that marked. On page 6, under section 1.3, economic assumptions of the plan, the most basic of all economic assumptions for Sanibel's planning is that Sanibel's economic fortune is directly related to the viability of its natural systems.
Wow, that's a very clear insight into the why. We're not just against development, we're protecting the golden goose, really.
That's right. And so as you read through the plan, the uniqueness of it that is exposed on the opening couple of lines of it is really integrated throughout the plan. And there's a great deal of consistency and time that went into that. Now, Porter Goss, who was the city's first mayor, he was the CIA director, he's had a real long career in government. He opened our session for strategic planning that we had on March 12th and March 16th.
Really?
Yeah,
How old is he?
I don't know what his age is, but he's timeless. You
know?
And whatever his age is, you would not.
He has presence.
He has this presence, and he has this knowledge about the island. And one of the ways that he described it is that when they established the island, that you were still going to have your piece of land that you could develop. You might not be able to develop as much of it, so your piece of it might be a little smaller. And but it will be more valuable because of that. And that again speaks to what's right here in the plan that I just read, is that underdevelopment of the island is really what's going to be its economic mainstay, and it's going to preserve that quality of life and character of the island. It's its identifying feature.
My concern is it feels like it's a tragedy of the commons kind of situation, because if everybody understands the value of the commons in this place, the wildlife, the natural assets that are referenced there, and they're willing to put any limits on their own economic activity because of that, then it all works. But I remember a case at Harvard Business School on the tragedy of the commons, and it was sort of terrified me, but it's true that any individual person might make the calculation that if I do this, my family's going to be better off. Yeah, there'll be a little effect on the commons, couple cows on the commons. That's not going to take up all the grass. And I've thought in reading the history of this, there was something about those pioneers like Goss, and I talked to a guy, Charles LaBeouf, who was an early, and these guys were like fierce. They were like Old Testament prophets who believed this stuff so much that I can see why they were able to get this to happen. Now we're at 9,000 units or whatever, and we're almost 50 years past that sort of formative period. Isn't it going to be kind of challenging to keep the spirit alive and the passion alive for this organizing idea of the island as you go down the next 50 years? Isn't it likely to sort of erode and entropy bit by bit sort of take it to a different place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, people who come from away, as they say in Maine, right, and have different ideas of how the island should be developed or what services they might want, might bring some of the different ideas. So
they're like invasive species.
They could be. They could be if they were allowed to sprout.
Yeah, right.
But, keeping them regulated, as we do with invasive species, is another way to look at it. And that's what the Land Development Code is really all about. So the Sanibel Plan sets everything up for us, and then the Land Development Code has all the regulations for land use and how that can be applied to a property depending on where it is. But the zoning here is so different and unique than any other place. It's not, S1, S2, multifamily, residential, commercial 1. It's environmental zones. And so it's based on what the conditions are environmentally on the island, and that provides some additional restrictions. So that protection of the island is really embedded in the code too. And then the stewardship is those who are elected to city council and those who are on staff to make sure that that's enhanced. Now, you always have somebody who's pushing up against it. You mentioned, and I'll just reference quickly, I had said when I read the plan that from Lee County's, when it was Lee County, unincorporated Lee County, was 30,000 units down to 7,800, and now we have about 9,000. The difference is where there were some lawsuits or concerns about property rights when the island incorporated, so that's where we ended up around 9,000.
Oh, I see. So it all happened kind of at once. It's not kind of gradual.
So 30,000 was where we are for potential. 7,800 was what the plan said, and then there were some modifications after that. But beyond that, as stewards of the code now, that's why we have a code in place, and we have a planning commission, and we have a variance process that staff reviews that code and applies it stringently.
Yeah.
People have the right to appeal, and that's why just this week I asked City Council to send the Land Development Code to the Planning Commission for interpretation around some definitions and also how those definitions are being applied in the code, so there's better clarity about what people can do and what people can't do on their lots. And I think that's going to be a good process. Other things that come up are permeable surfaces. So you have a lot, and only 30% of that lot can be developed. 25% of that lot, depending on the zoning, can have impervious surface on it.
Like a driveway.
A driveway or whatever it might be, pool. And then the developed areas, that's the 30% that's controlled. You can go to communities that are right around the corner, and they're developing 75 to 80% of the lots with different mechanisms to manage stormwater. So that's how that gets preserved. And so I think when most people come to the island, they know that they might want a little bit more, but as they go through the process, they understand what the restrictions are and how that is better for the whole.
What's the danger that the state encroaches on the ability of our community here to protect home rule? You're going to have to spend a lot of time in Tallahassee protecting what we have here against encroachment at that level?
Yeah, well, council does. Council spends their time, and I stay in tune with that. But there are always assaults on home rule that whether it's in Florida or other states where there wants to be a state wants to have some regulatory authority. But again, I think that takes away from the uniqueness of communities. And, I remember when I worked in Greenville, South Carolina, there was a desire to really slow down a road, which was a state road coming into the city. So you had this transitional phase into the downtown area, and where it's very walkable and pedestrian friendly. And the state didn't have a design standard for that transition. So we worked with them to develop one around this road and came to a compromise. Here, I think that if there was any real assault on what the qualities of the island are, I think that you would see a great response from the city. And I don't think that we would see some of that regulation desirable from the state. What the state has been trying to do, in fact, they're giving something back to us, I'll say that. They're going to allow municipalities, as long as it gets signed into a law, to be able to prohibit smoking in parks and beaches, which has been something that a lot of beachfront communities have wanted for some time. So sometimes the state taketh away and sometimes it giveth. But I think around the zoning, I feel pretty comfortable that there wouldn't be assault on the city zoning and land use provisions.
Yeah, well, that's good. But, and we've got a volunteer city council, so they're doing sort of normal city council stuff, and then they're kind of protecting the vision at the same time. So those are important seats.
Yeah, and that's another. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's another unique quality of the elected body here. Is that I came from a community just down the coast where they just voted themselves a pay raise, and I can't remember what their pay raise is, but when I was working there, we did a comparison of pay that city council and mayors receive throughout the state, and I think Naples is now the highest paid in the state, or if it's not the highest, it's one of the highest. And that's such a contrast, again, to come here and say, they're volunteers, and they're dedicating their time, and they're so committed. There's great synergy between them. They don't always agree on every item, but I think Vice Mayor Johnson said at this week's meeting, is that we might disagree, but we're not disagreeable.
Yeah.
And that's so refreshing.
And that's kind of, when I talked with Judy last year, the previous city manager, she talked about the vibe of Sanibel, and that not being disagreeable fits, politically. I know there are neighbors here that see the former president differently than I do, and it's okay. Some of that just doesn't seem so entrenched and everybody ready to take up arms as it feels here. Is that an accurate impression?
Yeah, I think it's clearly not a partisan community, and so those things are left behind, at least when we're talking about the local issues. But it's wonderful to see how they work together, both say on and off the field. So in council chamber and then away from council chamber, there's not a lot of issues that I've had to manage so far where we have a split council on this. How are we going to work through this?
No, that's huge.
Yeah.
In looking back over the jobs you've done before, there's a lot of parks and recreation stuff, and some of them, the titles I loved. You were Director of Parks, Cemeteries and Forestry in New Bedford, Director of Parks and Recreation in Portland and Marco Island, Director of Parks, Recreation, Sustainability in Greenville, and now you are city manager of a community that's almost 80% parks in a way. I mean, preserved land. Is there any kind of connection for all the time you spent in those other communities thinking about parks and recreational opportunities, outdoors, I assume, and the opportunities and challenges of a community with this big a park?
Yeah, and there are. And so I cut my teeth in the work as a grant writer in a planning department, and I started to write grants for park projects. And then those grants were successful, and somebody had to manage those projects, so I was able to move forward in my career and manage those projects. But an early influence was I managed, in Massachusetts at the time, they had a program through the Department of Environmental Management called the Frederick Law Olmsted Landscape Preservation Program. And New Bedford had a few landscapes that were designed by the firm of Frederick Law Olmsted. Charles Elliott was the primary landscape architect for Buttonwood Park in New Bedford, which is about 90 acres. That's a famous name in architecture. Yeah. And so Boston Emerald Necklace, New York Central Park, Prospect Park, some of the great spaces in there. And so the connection for me from a philosophical standpoint of terms of how Sanibel fits into my early training about preserving historic landscapes. So, and I'll just say this, New Bedford, the reason that Massachusetts developed that program is a lot of the Olmsted parks that were cultural and historic landscapes had been overdeveloped through the recreation movement. So these grand lawns that were developed in New York experienced the same thing in Prospect Park. So how do you undo that but still provide the services that the community needs and restore that pastoral sense of an urban within an urban landscape? Because one of the quotes from Olmsted about Central Park that has stuck with me my entire life is paraphrase is that when you arrive in the park, you want to see, hear, and feel nothing of the city beyond. So it was a respite, right, from all the pressures of the world and the development, especially the industrial movement. And so when you come to Sanibel, and again, the sense of leaving developed Lee County and coming over here, you get the sense of that you're leaving the hustle and bustle of the city behind you and coming to a place that's unique and different and that really understands the need to preserve that. So yes, there's 70 to 80% of conservation land on the island, and keeping that preserved is really critically important as part of our mission.
I love it how sometimes when I talk to people and I get to sort of see the arc of their careers, we don't often realize what we're being prepared for. You do this job and then you do it. You get a grant, you run a park. Now you're a Parks and Rec guy for your next city,
right.
And then the road brings you to this place. Do you have that sense of? You're a little younger than I am, but do you have a sense of how you've been kind of led through your life to this opportunity?
I do. I see that. I think that sometimes when you're in your mid-career and you see it, you don't really appreciate all of that development. But I think one thing that I feel very fortunate about my career that's allowed me to be hired and serve as city manager here in Sanibel is that working in parks and recreation, you have to engage with people. And you have to understand what they want and don't want, and you have to problem solve, and you have to try to be that negotiator that say, especially if you're doing master planning, which is a lot of my background, is that here are all the things that we want. Let's pick the things out that we agree on first, and so we have a win. And then let's work on the things that we need to compromise on so our community can have a win. And that develops a skill set. And when I worked in New Bedford as well, part of my progression was one of my titles was park planner and neighborhood relations manager. So in that community, as part of sort of an introduction into neighborhood, we would work on a park. And it might have been a place where there was no engagement for a long period of time. And my job was to get in there as the sole guy in my 20s and talk with people and understand what their issues are. Sort of, if there are beatings to take, I would be the first guy in to take the beating. And then there would be a strategy to how we were going to develop some improvements within there and then get in other city services. But that, again, gave me some great experiences and insight to not just the Parks and Rec world, but what are some of the broader community issues that are being faced. And so I've been fortunate that the folks I've worked with, even though my primary work has been within Parks and Recreation, I've been exposed to a lot of other areas. And it's all helped build that momentum for me and career experience to be able to serve as city manager here.
Well, and from what you said at the HOA meeting of the Dunes a few weeks ago, you talked about immersing yourself in the culture of the island. And I kind of pictured you showing up at every bean supper or whatever they have here, kind of without an agenda, just to be there and listen. But what have you learned about the best way to actually listen to what a neighborhood is saying, even if there's some conflict or whatever? It in my experience, interviewing people or just whatever, it's so hard to drop the things I think in order to really listen. But what other tricks have you learned in maybe, a bit of a tumultuous entry into a neighborhood or a group of people. How do you hear what you know you need to hear to help them get what they want?
Well, you use two words in your question that I think are important to make the distinction. There's listening and then there's hearing. So I can listen to you all day, but what are the takeaways that I have? Did I really hear what the issues are? Mm-hmm. And so I try to focus in on those. And, oftentimes in this work and in other industries, there's an emotional component of that, especially if they're unhappy with a service that's been provided. So I try to listen to that emotion, and then if I have to ask questions to get to the root of something, I will. I try to take note cards rather than a big tablet.
Why is that better?
But, for me, it's not a distraction. There are times that I do have my portfolio and I'm taking a broader set of notes if I'm in the office. But if I'm in the community, I try to have index cards, and I'll use those. And it's a place, it works better for me. It's a little more discreet. And
it doesn't break the connection with who you're listening to.
Right. I can scribble fast and then decipher later. So that's where I try to capture key points.
Yeah.
And then I also, when I sort of debrief from that, I look at what are the low-hanging fruit, if there's any that come out of the meeting, what are the things that we can respond to immediately, and then what are the things that are going to take a little bit longer, and to track them. So my assistant is tracking all these issues.
Yeah.
She logs them for me, so we don't have those that fall through the cracks. Sometimes they're not the highest one on the priorities, and people can become impatient, but it's all this how to synthesize the information and then build it. And there are commonalities between groups as well. One of the bigger issues that we're facing is our online permitting system, which hasn't gone well in its deployment. And so we're retraining folks and trying to understand what those issues are. I met with developers, I've met with residents, and there's similar frustrations. So we're approaching that. I hope that we'll have a solution pretty soon.
You say you listen to the emotions, and at the HOA meeting, I was impressed that all of a sudden people were rising up because of the people who take that shortcut through the dunes. And it was kind of moving a little bit beyond rational comments and some real heat. And I think I remember you doing the note cards. I also remember thinking, well, if I was one of these people, I think I would think this guy really heard me and he cares. He can't wave a magic wand and turn this into a private road. But those are very tough situations to keep your cool in. How do you do that?
Well, we were talking about before we started about controlled chaos, and that was one of the instances. Is that it felt like a very structured meeting right up until that point, right?
Right.
And then
the wheels came
broke
off
loose, and people were talking. There were multiple conversations that were going on. So I think what I tried to do is I walked to people and gave them my business card, and I said, "Wait, let's get together and talk about that," because I knew that from my experience and also the way that was unfolding that I wasn't going to be able to provide answers in whole, and we weren't going to be able to hush everybody down and listen to it. Which is why in a lot of engagement processes now, after you have that moment where you talk, you break into groups so you can work through what those issues are and everybody has a chance to be heard. But in the setting that we're in, the best way that I could have felt to approach it was hand out business cards, follow up with people, stay there as long as I needed to make sure that anybody who wanted to talk to me could. And Chief Dalton was there as well, and he did the same thing. And then we followed the same process. There were issues about vegetation in front of speed limit signs. So those, I think they've all been pruned. That's part of my next meeting when I tour the neighborhood to see if that's been done. We've contacted Waze and Google Maps to see if they could sort of eliminate this neighborhood from any tracking that they do.
Smart.
And they've told us, thanks, but no
talk
thanks.
To the algorithm.
Right. That's right. I like that. Which is another way of giving sign language. Right?
Yeah, right.
But we still have a process that we can work through to try to mitigate that. And so the chief and I and the city attorney are talking about that now.
Well, and I can see the benefit of that, because to the extent that you communicated that you weren't just going through the motions, you really would like to hear from people. I suspect that if somebody follows up and they get your card and they go and make an appointment, at that point maybe they're not shouting in a group, they're actually just talking to you And is that a setting where you actually have a better chance of finding a creative solution to something once the emotions have faded?
It does, but it also, there's another process that I like to follow involved in that. Is there are folks who will follow up with you and they have an issue that they want to communicate, but is that really the position of the broader community?
Right.
So some of the traffic calming issues that came up during that meeting that are within the neighborhood, not just about the how are people cutting through to beat the periwinkle traffic, but. So I've said I'm happy to listen to you, but I really need to get a position from the board on that because there is an HOA.
Yeah.
And that would be a good format that I would be happy to come back to and be present at those meetings, have staff be present at those meetings.
Sure.
But I would want there to be some structure to that. So if we're coming back for specific issues that we can
that makes sense.
Work through that together.
Because you can get hijacked if you're just dealing with the loudest voice.
Yeah, and the loudest voice, sometimes I call it my own terminology is the Velcro mentality, is that when you get into those group settings is that somebody starts talking about an issue and it really can snowball or Velcro, and everything is then sticking and becomes that emotional, and the emotions are great too. I mean, I don't want to minimize people's emotional attachment to issues because it is a way that you can identify what's the true concerns of the community.
Well, I bet there were a lot of emotions expressed in the 70s when Charles LaBeouf and those guys, I bet they didn't arrive at every meeting with the developers looking like they were very rational because they were on a mission.
Right. Yeah, the 70s, there were a lot of emotions displayed everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. That's how we got disco.
That's right.
Well, I can imagine that your day quickly gets off schedule, so I'm sure we could talk more, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk, sometime in the next few months or whatever.
Happy to do that.
And but appreciate you taking the job, and I like the fact that we both sort of arrived on the island. Really the same within a month of each other,
right,
in our official capacity. Me as a homeowner, and you as the city manager. So I can, from my heart, say I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks. And I'm here. Let's talk again. I'd be happy to do that. I'm sure I'll have different perspectives in a couple of months, so let's revisit.
That'll be great. I have been speaking with Dana Souza, the city manager here in Sanibel, Florida. Thanks very much, Dana.
Thank you.
I was glad I had a chance to ask Dana about that HOA meeting where I first saw him handle a group of his constituents, community members in our neighborhood. It doesn't surprise me that in the conversation he said that he did follow up on the notes that he made on the index cards with my neighbors who were so upset about the traffic, or that his office contacted Google and Waze to see if there was anything they could do to generate fewer trips through the neighborhood. It was a good try. I can understand that it's pretty tough to go against an algorithm like that, but I like the kind of proactive way that he handled those complaints. And clearly there's been other ideas that have been kicked around. It was a pleasure to meet him in person and learn how well prepared he is to lead Sanibel into the future. And as someone who has recently come from away to make a home on this island, I look forward to supporting Dana Souza in any way I can in his work as city manager. I think we're lucky to have him. I have 2 author interviews coming up this month, both of them arranged by my guest last month, Kristen Ilardi of Penguin Random House. The authors are Michelle Huneven, author of Search, available for pre-order with release April 26th, and Colleen Hubbard, author of Housebreaking, which will be released on April 19th. That's Patriots Day back in Boston. And you'll find links to those books in the show notes. Darlene and our designer friend from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Kathleen Klein, have been gathering terrific rugs and furniture and art for the house this week. They've been roaming down toward Naples, and they head out in the Tesla and come back with all kinds of treasures, and then sometimes movers arrive with things. So I'm getting a nice show of new things that are turning the house into great living space. And as always, my wife is bringing bright colors into our living space with a nod to the southwestern Florida vibe on the island. We are going to head back to Cambridge in just about 3 weeks, taking a leisurely route bypassing D.C. and New York City with our Tesla Model Y doing most of the driving. As always, you can hear my morning journal every weekday on your Alexa Flash Briefing platform. To set it up, just say, Alexa, enable morning journal to one of your Alexa devices. Once the skill is enabled, you can just say, Alexa, flash each morning to hear the 5-minute audio file that I record on my iPhone and upload to the Amazon Blueprints website. I think that's everything. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Sanibel Island, Florida. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. Have a great day.